The chamber is open and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. The street in Cokeworth that people who had once lived there, called by the name of the canal, had been declining for long enough that the decline had become the street's identity. Milltown terraces with their backs to the water. The specific smell of industrial stone and slow-moving cold that had not left even now that the mills were silent. Sodium street lamps that lit nothing warmly. Number 14 had its curtains drawn. They had been drawn for 2 days, since the night the war ended, which Severus Snape knew because he had not opened them. He had not opened them because opening them would mean acknowledging that there was a world outside, and the world outside was one in which Lily Evans was dead. He had been carrying that fact for 48 hours with the manner of a man still in the process of understanding what he is carrying. He was sitting at the kitchen table. The table held 3 cups of tea made and not drunk, a newspaper he had not read past the first line, and a bundle of ministry correspondence he had not opened. The correspondence from Dumbledore's office had arrived 2 hours ago. He had read it once and placed it face down. The knock at the door was not something he was expecting. She was on the step when he opened it. She was perhaps 2 years old. He would later determine 2 years, 1 month, and 13 days, which was the kind of precision he brought to everything, including the things he did not wish to be precise about. She was wrapped in a muggle blanket, the cheap flannel kind, and she was awake. Her eyes were dark brown and very serious, and they were looking at him with the quality of a small person who had not yet learned that strangers required a different register. She looked at him as though she recognized him. He looked at her as though she were a problem. There was a letter tucked into the blanket. The handwriting on the envelope was careful, formal, constrained. He opened it. Her name is Hermione Jean Granger. Her parents were Richard and Monica Granger, dentists, muggles, killed in circumstances connected to the war's final days that the Ministry has classified and that I cannot document here. She has no magical relatives. She has no muggle relatives who are safe to contact. She has nowhere to go. I have read the reports of your conduct at the end. I know what you did, and I know what it cost you. I am not asking you to do this because I think you owe it. I am asking because there is no one else, and because you are, despite everything, a person of extraordinary capacity who has chosen to use that capacity in the service of something that mattered. She is exceptionally magical. Even at 2 years old, the diagnostic reads like nothing I have seen in a child this young. She will need someone who will not waste that. You do not have to say yes. But you are the door I am knocking on first. Albus Snape read the letter twice. He looked at the child. She looked back. She had been looking at him the entire time with the patience of someone who had already decided to wait for the outcome rather than influence it. He said, to no one in particular, and therefore to her, this is a catastrophically unwise idea. She made a sound that was not agreement. He stepped back from the door, not in the way of someone welcoming a visitor, but in the specific way of someone who has made a decision and is implementing it before he has finished making it, which was the Snape mode of decision-making that he would spend the rest of his life pretending was not his primary mode. He picked up the bundle. He closed the door. The house at the other address had been dark for a long time. Not empty. Old houses with long magical histories were never empty in the precise sense, and this one had a portrait in the entrance hall and a house elf in the kitchen, and the specific accumulated weight of a family whose magic had been building in the walls for centuries. But dark, in the sense of not inhabited by someone who belonged. Sirius Black had not been back since he left at 16. He was back now because there was nowhere else to go. He had been cleared 2 days ago in a room that smelled of bureaucratic urgency and political embarrassment, and then he had walked out of the ministry building into a city that was still celebrating, and he had stood on the pavement for a long time before he understood that he had nowhere to be. James was gone. Lily was gone. Peter was in custody now, which was the only thing that felt like justice, and justice was a cold thing compared to what had been taken. He had come here because Dumbledore's letter said to come here, and because it said that Harry was here, and because Harry was the only thing left that connected him to the people he was grieving. He had been in the entrance hall for 7 minutes without moving further. Harry was asleep against his shoulder. The arm holding the boy was steady. Some instinct had commandeered it, some specific refusal to let the tremor reach the place where the child was resting. His other hand was shaking. He sat on the floor. He sat on the floor of the entrance hall of the house he had spent 15 years hating, because standing required a decision about where to stand, and he did not have the resources for that decision. Harry slept. Sirius sat. From somewhere in the kitchen, there was a small, resentful sound of movement. Creature, ancient, bound to the house. Contemptuous of the half-blood son who had disgraced the family, was aware that a Black had returned. He would not come out. Not yet. But the house knew. Sirius read Dumbledore's letter an hour later, when Harry had woken and expressed opinions about his current state, which Sirius had addressed with a warming charm and the distant memory of something his mother had once done in a moment of unusual softness. Sirius, you are the godfather, which makes you the first door. The other people who would have been asked are dead, or in positions that make this impossible. Harry is the son of James, and of Lily, whose protection is now inside him in a form that will take years to fully understand. The war is over. What I know is this: the boy needs someone who will not make him into a symbol, who will not require him to carry more than a child should carry. Who will, if I am asking too much, tell me honestly so that I can find another door. You were the best of them. Once, before everything that happened. I am asking you to be that again. Albus Sirius did something with his face that was not crying, because he had already run out of crying, which was a physiological state he had not known was possible until this week. Harry made a sound. Sirius looked at him. Green eyes. Lily's eyes entirely, looking up with the uncomplicated attention of a 15-month-old who had not yet learned to perform his looking. He said, "All right." It was addressed to Harry and to the house and to the choice he had already made without knowing he was making it. Then he said, "We're going to need food." It was the first practical thought he had managed in 2 days. Creature, listening from the kitchen doorway, made a noise that could have been interpreted as professional disapproval and began, reluctantly, to open cupboards. What Snape learned, in the months that followed, she was not a passive presence. She observed everything, and she was interested in everything she observed. And the combination produced in his household a quality he did not have a name for. A second consciousness moving through the same space, reading the same things he read from a different angle. He had never shared a space before with someone whose attention matched his own for sustained intensity, which meant he had never understood how much of his solitude was the specific solitude of a person whose attention outpaced the room. She kept pace. He did not document this. He noted it the way he noted things he did not yet have adequate language for, by going back to the laboratory and working, and by not closing the connecting door. She said her first sentence at just past 2.5, which was not unusual for a child her age except in its precision. He had been attempting to explain why a particular ingredient had to be added at a specific moment, not because she could understand potions, but because she was in the room and looking at him with the expression she had when she was building a model of something. She said, clearly, with the complete confidence of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to deploy language, "You should have said that first." He put down the stirring rod. She was correct. He had explained the consequence before explaining the cause, which was the less efficient structure. He said, yes. She went back to what she was doing, which was arranging a set of small stones she had found on the doorstep, in a pattern that he looked at for 3 days before he understood was a classification system. He wrote to Dumbledore that evening. The letter was short. It said, "She told me my explanation structure was inefficient. She was correct. What do I do with that? Dumbledore's reply arrived the next morning, precisely what you were doing. Continue what Sirius learned, in the same months, that Harry was a morning person, which was genetically inexplicable and he took personally. Harry found people interesting in the structural sense, who watched them the way Sirius had once watched Moody work, tracking and evaluating and occasionally appearing to reach a conclusion. Being on the receiving end of that watching from a 15-month-old was an experience Sirius did not have adequate language for. He called Remus in the 3rd month. Remus Lupin arrived on a Tuesday, which happened to be 2 weeks before the full moon, and he came in with the look of someone who had been waiting to be asked, and who will not say so. He stood in the entrance hall of Grimmauld Place, which had been refusing to cooperate with Sirius in various quiet ways, the staircase creaking at inconvenient hours, the kitchen fire slow to light. And he looked at Harry, who was in the middle of the floor investigating a wooden spoon with both hands. Remus said, "Hello, Harry?" Harry looked up, considered Remus for a long moment, and went back to the spoon. Remus sat down on the floor and looked at Sirius and said, "You should have called earlier." "I know. How are you eating?" "Creature cooks." Remus looked at the house elf, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with the expression of an entity that has made its professional objections known through every available channel and has been ignored. Creature gave Remus the look of someone recognizing a fellow sufferer in an unreasonable household, which was probably the most warmth he had ever extended to anyone not of the Black bloodline. Remus gave the house elf a small, acknowledging nod, which appeared to produce in Creature something between surprise and calculation. Over the following months, Creature and Remus reached a specific accommodation that neither of them named, and that consisted of Creature leaving food outside Remus's room during the bad days of the moon cycle, and Remus thanking him for it in a way that treated it as a kindness rather than a service, which was the one currency Creature had not expected to receive and therefore did not know how to refuse. Remus did not leave for 3 months. He returned every month, in the week before the moon and the week after, which was the rhythm they had worked out without discussing it. Remus knew what the days around the moon cost him, and Sirius knew not to pretend they didn't. Harry learned the moon the way children learn the things that are simply part of their household, without drama, the way they learn that some houses have dogs, and some don't, and some have a week every month where Moony needs quiet. He called Remus Moony before he called him anything else, which Sirius noted with a mixture of feelings he chose not to examine closely. What Remus brought to the household, beyond his presence, the specific patience that he had developed by necessity over 20 years of managing a condition that gave him no days off, and required him to plan around pain with a thoroughness that most people never needed to apply to anything. He did not perform this patience. It was structural. It was in how he read to Harry in the evenings, steadily, without rushing the parts that were difficult to pronounce, and without skipping the parts that might be confusing, treating each page as worth the time required for it. Harry, Sirius noticed, listened differently to Remus than he listened to anyone else. He listened to Sirius with the full alertness of someone reading a fast-moving source. He listened to Remus more slowly, as if Remus's steadiness were a thing he was absorbing alongside the words. "He trusts you differently than he trusts me," Sirius told Remus one evening. Remus was quiet for a moment. "He trusts you for the momentum," he said. "He trusts me for the ground." Sirius looked at the ceiling. "That's not a complaint," Remus said. "I know it isn't." Sirius picked up his cup of tea. I want to be both. You can't be both. That's not a failing. That's what it means to have more than one person." Sirius held this. "James was both," he said. Remus said, "James had you for the momentum," which was the most Remus had said about James in 2 years, and which cost him something visible, and which he didn't look away from, and which produced in Sirius the specific gratitude of someone being shown that their grief is not the only grief in the room. The defense instruction began at 4. Sirius did not call it defense. He called it How to Think About Dangerous Things, which was the framework Mad-Eye Moody had used in Auror training, hard-won from years in the field, and which Sirius had been adapting for a small child who kept asking questions that turned out to be precisely the right questions. The framework was, every dangerous thing has properties you can read before it hurts you, and reading those properties is learnable. He applied it first to the physical world. Which plants were safe? How to read water that was moving fast. The way that unstable ground sounds different from stable ground if you pay attention. He applied it to the social world second. Which kinds of attention were safe? How to read the gap between what someone said and what they meant. Harry was interested in the physical version and resistant to the social one. Sirius noted this and didn't push. He came back to it from different angles. He found that the easiest angle was honesty about himself, which was both the most effective approach and the one that cost him the most. When Harry asked at 4.5 why people lied, Sirius said, "Because they want something and they don't think the truth will get it." Harry said, "Do you lie?" "I used to. More than I should have." "Why don't you now?" "Because it stopped working," Sirius said, "and because someone I loved was very good at spotting it, and being caught out by someone who loves you is the worst kind of caught out." Harry absorbed this with the particular seriousness he brought to new information. "Who was it?" he said. "Your mum," Sirius said. And then, because the question deserved a full answer, "Your dad too. They were both very good at it." It was the first time he had said their names to Harry in context, rather than in passing, and it cost something, and it was worth it. Molly Weasley appeared in Harry's 3rd year at Grimmauld Place with a batch of soup and the direct manner of a woman who has 7 children and therefore no patience for indirection. She was a friend of the Order, and she knew Sirius had been cleared, and she had opinions about whether a 23-year-old man with no domestic experience was providing adequate meals for a small child. Her opinions were delivered without apology and received without offense. Sirius recognized in Molly Weasley the same quality he recognized in good field partners. The person who said the true thing rather than the comfortable thing, and who did it because they cared rather than because they wanted to win. She came back the following week, and the week after that. By the time Harry was 5, the Weasley family's regular presence at Grimmauld Place had become something that nobody had planned and everyone had adjusted to. With Ron appearing at Harry's shoulder in the kitchen as naturally as a shadow, and Ginny occasionally reading Sirius's books from the shelf she could reach, and putting them back with the spines slightly misaligned, which Sirius never mentioned, because he found it funny. At Spinner's End, Hermione was 5 when she told Snape there was a mistake on page 14 of the botanical classification text he had left on the kitchen table. He opened to the page. There was a mistake on page 14, a genus name misprinted, and she had found it after reading 14 pages of botanical classification and tracking the nomenclature carefully enough to catch the inconsistency. He said, "Good." He went to make tea, which was what he did when something had happened that he needed to process before he responded to it. When he came back, she was at the table rereading from the beginning, a thin-lined notebook open beside her, writing things down. He said, "Are those notes?" She said, "Corrections." He looked at the notebook. There were 7 corrections. He sat down and drank his tea and watched her work, and the room had the quality it always had when they were both occupied at the same time. Not silence exactly. Something more specific. The sound of 2 people who did not require the other person to fill the space. The proper potions instruction began that same year. Not formally. He did not announce it. He simply allowed her into the laboratory in the mornings, which was what she had wanted since she was old enough to reach the door. With 3 explicit conditions, she did not touch anything without asking. She asked what each thing was before asking what it did. And she told him when she did not understand rather than proceeding on incomplete information. She kept the conditions with the precision of a child who did not make agreements she did not intend to honor. When she asked about her parents at 6, she asked the way she asked everything significant, directly, without approach. Who were they? He put down the text he was reading. Their names were Richard and Monica Granger. They were dentists. They were muggles, people without magical ability. They were competent professionals and attentive parents, from everything I could find documented. I did not know them personally. Is that sad? He was quiet. It is something, he said. I have not fully determined what. She looked at him with the assessment she used for everything. I think it might be sad, she said without sentimentality, as a reading of available evidence. Yes, he said. Possibly she went back to her book. That evening he wrote to Dumbledore. She asked about her parents. She told me it might be sad. She has a more direct relationship with emotional truth than I do. Dumbledore's reply said, This is generally true of children. The directness is worth protecting. He considered this for a long time. Protection of a capacity rather than from a condition. He was learning that. Harry asked about Voldemort at 8. He had read the name in Sirius's correspondence, which Sirius kept in a desk drawer he considered private, and which Harry had been reading since he was 5, and had told Sirius about when he was 8, and Sirius had said he should have locked the drawer, and then said he was glad Harry had read it, because now there was context he didn't have to explain separately. He had read the name in the history books Remus kept on the second-floor landing, and had been waiting for what he judged was the right moment to ask, which he identified as a Tuesday when Sirius was in the specific good mood that followed productive morning work. He said, Voldemort. The person who killed my parents? Sirius put down his cup. Yes, he's gone now. He's diminished, not gone entirely. Dumbledore thinks whatever's left can't do anything right now. But something's left. Yes, Harry said. Will it try to come back? Sirius said, I think eventually something like that tries. What do we do when it does? Sirius looked at him across the kitchen table. He had been dreading some version of this question since Harry was born, and was aware that the dread had never been about the question. The dread was about whether his answer would be good enough. He said, We learn everything we can before it happens. Then we do what's right. Harry said, Will I be part of it? You might be. There are things about what your mother did, the specific way she protected you, that we don't fully understand yet. It might mean that whatever's left of Voldemort is connected to you. Connected how? That's what Dumbledore is still working out. Harry thought about this for a long time. Then he said, All right. Sirius said, All right. It doesn't change anything. I'm still going to learn everything I can. And do what's right. He said it with the steadiness he had already developed at 8. The steadiness of someone who had been prepared well enough to receive hard information without reorganizing his foundations, because the foundations were built for it. Sirius looked at the ceiling and thought, James would have said exactly that. He said this out loud. Harry said, What would my mum have said? Sirius said, She would have asked 4 follow-up questions and then agreed with your father after establishing that he'd arrived at the right conclusion for insufficient reasons. Harry considered this. He said, I'd like to be both. I think. Sirius said, You already are. In the spring before Hogwarts, Harry found the training broom in the Grimmauld Place garden shed. Sirius had put it there deliberately, and then pretended he had forgotten it, which was a specific kind of strategy he had developed for giving Harry things without it looking like a gift. Because Harry at 9 had the particular resistance to gifts that children develop when they are aware they have already received the largest possible gift, and it seems ungrateful to want smaller ones. Harry did not ask. He went to the shed himself one Saturday morning while Sirius was reading in the kitchen, and Sirius heard the shed door and heard the silence that followed, and went out to find Harry standing in the garden with the broom in his hands, reading it. He said, I can show you how to use it, if you want. Harry said, Can I try first? That was Harry. He wanted to try first, and then be shown. which was the opposite of most people's preferred sequence, and the correct sequence for someone who learned most effectively from their own errors. He kicked off. He was 8 feet off the ground before Sirius could say anything, and then he was on the ground again because the broom had responded to his inexperience with the ruthless neutrality of an object that did not weight its outcomes. And Harry sat up in the grass with the expression of someone who had received new information. He said, again. Sirius taught him what he knew about flying, which was considerable, and Remus, who avoided brooms on professional grounds, which he described as a developed professional skepticism about objects that move faster than my comfort threshold, taught him everything adjacent to flying, the history and theory and the rules of Quidditch, which Harry absorbed with the appetite he brought to anything that was simultaneously intellectual and physical. At Spinner's End, Hermione was solving a problem she had found herself. She was 8. The problem was derived from that morning's laboratory work, and it was a problem that existed in the professional literature, one that Snape had published a partial solution to years earlier and that had remained open. She did not know this. She had arrived at it from first principles, through a reasoning chain she could show step by step, and her framing of the problem was different from the standard framing in a way that was, as he spent 3 evenings confirming, actually more tractable. He told her none of this. He said, "Interesting problem. Where did you find it?" "I made it up. From this morning. Show me how you got there." She showed him. He followed the chain. He asked about the second step. She said, "The direct route has a wrong assumption in it." He said, "Show me." She did. She was correct. He said, "Work on the problem. Come back when you have something worth showing." She took the paper and went. He sat at the desk for a long time. He wrote to Dumbledore. The letter said, "She is 8. She found a problem from my published work independently and identified the flaw in the standard approach. What do you recommend?" Dumbledore's reply, arriving the next morning, said, "I recommend not being surprised. She was remarkable at 2 years old. She has not stopped." He did not reply to the reply. He went back to the laboratory, where she was already working, the paper on the floor in front of her. The room was quiet, in the way of 2 people who inhabited silence rather than performed it. The platform presented itself on the morning when the academic year began in the way that things that happen annually always present themselves, chaotic, in a way that is also, if you know the pattern, precisely organized. The distribution of family clusters, the pattern of trunk placement, the owl and cat and toad population, and their respective contributions to the ambient noise. Hermione read all of this before stepping fully onto the platform. Snape had not accompanied her onto the platform. They had discussed this in the practical way they discussed most things, and had agreed that his presence among several hundred families and their children would produce reactions he found inefficient and she found unnecessary. He had walked with her to the barrier and seen her through. He said, at the barrier, before she went, "Write when you've been sorted." She said, "How will I know which house?" He said, "You'll recognize it." She filed this as an answer that would become clearer with context and went through. She found a compartment in the 3rd carriage by the method she used to find everything, reading the available options for the property combination she needed, which was space for her trunk, a window, and no occupants likely to interfere with reading. She unpacked the books organized by the subject order she had determined was most useful given what she already knew about the first-year curriculum. She had read the first-year curriculum twice. The second reading had been specifically for gaps, things referenced without explanation, things that didn't connect clearly to adjacent concepts. She had a list of 47 such gaps. She was on the 3rd book when the compartment door opened. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of a trunk on wheels handled with more energy than precision, and then a pause at the door. And then, "Can I sit here?" She read him in the first 2 seconds, which was the standard time she needed for a new person with no prior information available. Dark hair, green eyes, someone raised in an environment that took him seriously without making him take himself too seriously. The way he stood was the way of someone comfortable in his own body because he had been using it deliberately for a long time. He was also, she noticed, reading her in the same 2 seconds. She said, "Yes." He came in and lifted his trunk to the overhead rack with more ease than its size suggested was easy, which told her something about his physical training. He said, "I'm Harry." Hermione, a pause. He said, "Are you nervous?" "No. Are you?" "No." He looked at the window. "My guardian said I would be nervous and should be prepared for it." "Sirius raised you," she said. It was not a question. The way he said the name contained the register of someone saying the most familiar word they knew. "Yes, since I was 15 months old. Your parents were killed when I was 15 months old." "Yeah." He said it without flinching, the way of someone who had been given the information young enough and gently enough that it was simply part of the architecture rather than a wound. "Then, yours too?" "I was just past 2. I don't remember them." He said, "I'm sorry." It was the accurate thing to say, and he said it without performing the accuracy. "Thank you," she said. "I'm sorry too." He said, "Who raised you?" "Severus Snape." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Sirius doesn't speak well of him." "What does he say?" Harry considered. He says he's brilliant, but that they have complicated history. He says Snape was important to your mother specifically." She said, "He doesn't talk about that period. He talks about the work." Harry nodded. He said, "Sirius talks about my parents constantly. It's good, but sometimes I need the present to be its own thing, and there's no way to say that without it sounding as if I don't care, which isn't it." "You need the present to be its own thing sometimes," she said. "Yes, exactly that." She looked at him. He had said it well. She went back to her book. He looked out the window, and the train moved, and they were in the specific parallel attention of 2 people who were comfortable enough with their own interior worlds to not require the other person to fill the space. 20 minutes later he said, "What are you reading?" She showed him. It was a 3rd-year theoretical text she had selected for the 12 gaps it addressed. He said, "That's 3rd year." "Yes, for 1st years going to Hogwarts." The 1st-year materials addressed 35 of my 47 gaps. This addresses 12 more. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can I see the list?" She looked at him. She handed over the notebook. He read it carefully, not scanning, reading, following the logic of each item rather than cataloging them. At the 31st entry he paused. "The wand affinity question," he said. "Sirius says that's not well understood even at expert level. It's in the literature as a known unknown. The standard textbook presents it as settled. The literature doesn't. You've read the literature. Some of it." He handed the notebook back. "What does Snape think about the wand affinity question?" he said. "He thinks the current framework is inadequate. He hasn't published on it. Why not?" He says publishing on something when you don't have the answer is contributing noise rather than signal. "That sounds right. I think so too," she said. Although there's an argument that framing the question correctly is worth publishing even without the answer, because it allows other people to approach it with better framing. What does he say to that? He says that if the framing is correct, competent researchers reading the existing literature will arrive at it independently. That publishing it separately assumes they cannot do the reading. Harry said, "That seems optimistic about the reading habits of the field." "Yes, I have told him so." "What did he say?" "He said I was probably right and moved on," she said. Which is what he does when he concedes a point without conceding a point. Harry laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not deployed, and it changed the quality of the compartment in the specific way that honest laughter does. Ron Weasley arrived 40 minutes before the train reached the school, because all the other compartments were full. He came in with the ease of someone from a large family, someone for whom strangers had never been a particular category. He looked at Hermione's book and then at Harry and said, I'm Ron. Ron Weasley. Harry said, Harry! Ron's expression did the small recalibration of someone hearing a name with unexpected weight. Harry Potter? Yes, right. A pause. My mum told me about you. Most people's mums have. What does your mum say? Ron thought. She says you should be treated normally, that it's not fair to the kid to make everything about the name. Harry said, Your mum sounds like Sirius. By the time the train pulled into Hogsmeade Station, all three of them had eaten some of whatever Ron had in his pockets, which turned out to be considerable. Ron had demonstrated a spell twice and received accurate structural feedback from Hermione, which he had initially resisted, and then, on the third attempt, used to improve his execution. And the specific arrangement of three people who had determined through organic conversation that they were compatible had settled into place around them like something that had been waiting to happen. Professor McGonagall led the first-year students through the castle with the efficient authority of a woman who has done this exact thing many times and finds it no less significant for the repetition. She was precise about which corridor, precise about where to wait, and when she smiled at a cluster of students who were pressing their faces against the great hall doors, she did not tell them to stop, which told you something about her if you were reading. The sorting hat came down over Hermione's eyes, and she was in the dark with something that was reading her the way she read things. The first time she had been on the receiving end of a comprehensive reading, and she found it interesting, if not quite comfortable. The hat said, in the voice of something that is made of old material and is not, You've been prepared. Is that a problem? No, most haven't been. You're unusual in degree, not in kind. A pause. You know where you belong. She did know. She had known from the reading she'd done on the train. Gryffindor, the hat called out, and the table on the left erupted with the particular enthusiasm of a house that has been waiting. Across the hall, when Harry's name was called and he sat down under the hat, his expression from where she was sitting was the same as hers had been, interested rather than anxious. The hat paused. Harry, she would learn later, had a brief internal conversation about which house would be most useful, concluded by the hat that whatever he wanted, this was where he belonged. Gryffindor, it announced, and Harry walked to the table and sat beside her and said, I thought so. So did I. Ron landed beside Harry shortly after, with the relief of someone who had been hoping for a specific outcome and received it. A red-haired girl sat across from Hermione and introduced herself as Ginny Weasley, Ron's younger sister, she explained, and then immediately demonstrated that she was her own person by conducting a very accurate assessment of all three of them in the space of a dinner conversation. Hermione filed this as someone who reads people for self-protection rather than for interest, which produces a slightly different quality of reading, but not a less accurate one. She read the faculty table last. When she found Snape's face, it held the expression he used when receiving confirmation of a hypothesis. She gave him the smallest possible acknowledgement, the specific orientation of her attention in his direction for long enough to be intentional. He received it and looked away. The first week of classes. She had read the curricula. What she found in the classroom was the specific experience of someone who has studied a map carefully and is now standing in the territory, accurate at the level of documentation, but containing a quality the documentation could not transmit. The way it felt when McGonagall demonstrated a transfiguration, the specific quality of will and precision and something adjacent to effort, this was not something any text had captured. She revised her model. This was what she had been doing since she was 3. In Charms, Professor Flitwick watched her produce a successful Wingardium Leviosa on the second attempt, and made a note in the small book he kept. He had the quality of a teacher who had been looking for something and had found it and did not need to perform the finding. In Potions, Snape did not call on her, which was the arrangement they had agreed to before term began. He would not preferentially call on her, he would not avoid her, and her work would be assessed against the same standard as anyone else's. She had agreed to these terms and was finding the first one difficult, because the questions he asked were questions she had already answered in her head, and the answers were not being deployed. She managed this with margin notes. After the third potions class, Harry read the margin notes in her text and said, "You're running a parallel session in your own notes." "Yes, because he won't call on you." "Because we agreed he wouldn't call on me preferentially." The questions he's asking aren't about potions knowledge. They're about reasoning process. He's testing whether students know how to arrive at answers, not whether they know the answers. Harry was quiet. Then Sirius does that. He asks questions about my reasoning. They must have developed similar methods. Or they arrived at the same method independently, Harry said, which would suggest the method is correct regardless of who found it. She looked at him. "Or both," she said. "Or both," he agreed. The first significant confrontation happened in the second week. Draco Malfoy stopped at the Gryffindor table at breakfast with the quality of someone who had prepared what he was going to say and was delivering it as planned. He looked at Harry and said, "Potter, my father is Lucius Malfoy. You'll have heard the name." Harry said, "I've heard it." "Then you'll know that the people who understand what you represent—" "I don't represent anything," Harry said. "I represent my own business. What other people decide I represent is generally their business. I try not to confuse the two." Draco processed this. His eyes moved to Hermione. He said, "Granger, Snape's ward. My father says Snape is brilliant, but uses his brilliance badly." She said, "I would be curious what your father considers using brilliance well. I suspect the answer is using it in the service of things your father wants. I'm not particularly interested in that criterion." Draco said, "You're Muggleborn." "Yes, Snape's ward and Muggleborn." She said, "Specific to my circumstances, yes. Is there a relevant point you're developing, or have you finished?" He left, not in the way of someone who had been defeated, in the way of someone who had encountered an environment that required more preparation than they had brought. Harry, watching him go, said, "That was well done. The principle he's using," she said, "is worth understanding rather than dismissing. He's testing whether I'll respond to the word as a wound. I won't, because Snape told me when I was 5 that there are words people use as weapons, and that knowing the weapon before it's deployed is more useful than being surprised by it." Harry said, "Sirius says something similar. He calls it reading the attack before it lands. The same principle from 2 different formulations. Dumbledore," Harry said, "through both of them. She filed this." It was the second time they had arrived at that conclusion. The room Harry found was off a corridor on the 3rd floor, behind a door that presented as maintenance access, and was therefore not a door that most people read as a door. He had found it by reading the corridor, which was how he found most things, by reading the difference between how spaces presented and what they actually were. The room was 40 feet by 30, with east-facing windows that caught the morning light, and it became theirs in the way that spaces become theirs when you find them before anyone has assigned you to designated spaces. Saturday sessions began by accident in November and became practice by persistence. She brought problems. Harry worked on them from angles she hadn't tried. Ron, who arrived for the 3rd session because he had worked out something useful was happening, provided the specific function of identifying where a problem was actually harder than either of them had acknowledged. Neville Longbottom joined in the 2nd month. She had found Neville in the library after the potions assessment where Snape had correctly identified that his temperature had been too high for 8 minutes and the result was unusable. Neville had been reading the same passage repeatedly without its meaning changing. She sat across from him. "Tell me what you were tracking during the assessment. The steps. Whether I'd done each one. What were you not tracking?" he thought. "The potion itself? You were tracking the instructions, not what the instructions were producing. The textbook tells you what to see, but not that there are 4 other ways to read the same information. The consistency, the temperature of the steam, the sound the mixture makes when the heat is too high, the smell of incorrect development at each stage. The color change is a late indicator. By the time it's wrong, the error is usually 8 to 12 minutes in the past. Neville stared at her. Why doesn't the textbook say that? That, she said, is the question I'm going to ask Snape. She did, in the notes she showed him that Sunday, the notes that had evolved over the first months of term from documentation into something more like research. Why does the standard curriculum teach one reading method when 5 are available, and a student with access to all 5 has significantly better real-time assessment capacity than a student with access to 1? He read the notes. He was quiet. Then, the decision was made by a committee in the early 1970s. The stated reasoning was standardization. They argued that multiple reading methods increased cognitive load for students with lower aptitude. The effect is that higher aptitude students receive a curriculum calibrated for lower ones and are therefore underserved. Yes, you teach the standard curriculum. I teach what the curriculum specifies, with occasional supplementation. For students who ask. For students who ask, he said. None of them know to ask, she said. Because they don't know the methods exist. Someone has to make the unknown known. He said, that is a question about what you want to do with your capacity. I can't answer it for you. She taught Neville the 5 methods on the following Saturday. His practice results improved significantly within 2 weeks. On Halloween, there was a troll in the girls' bathroom. She was there because she had overheard Ron say something in the corridor 2 hours earlier that she had been processing in the bathroom since. Not crying exactly, processing. The content of what he had said was not new information. What she was processing was the specific quality of hearing it from someone she had begun to trust. She was mid-processing when the smell arrived, and then the troll, and then, the door opening, Harry and Ron. She moved to the wall before Harry said to. He was already inside, reading the space between her and the exit, reading the troll's weapon and size and movement pattern. Ron, behind him, looked at the troll, looked at Harry, and raised his wand. Wingardium Leviosa. The club rose and descended on the troll's head. The troll was on the floor. She stood against the wall with the specific quality of someone who had been in genuine danger and had not yet finished processing it. Harry said, "Are you all right?" "Yes, A-beat. You came to find me. We heard you weren't at the feast." She read him. She said, Ron. Ron, still looking at the unconscious troll, looked at her. She said what you said. In the corridor. He went very still. "I heard," she said. "I'm not asking for an apology right now. We have a troll on the floor and we're going to have to explain ourselves to McGonagall. After that, if you want to say something, I'll listen." McGonagall arrived 30 seconds later. In the corridor afterward, Ron said, "I didn't mean it. The no friends part. I was frustrated and I said something mean and I knew it was going to hurt you and I said it anyway." She read him. "Why?" she said. "Because being mean when you're frustrated feels better for about 10 seconds, and then it feels worse than before." What makes it feel worse? He thought. Both. That it didn't work, and that I did it, but more that I did it. "You knew it would hurt me." "Yes, the apology is accepted," she said. He looked at her. "Just like that? You identified what you did wrong without me explaining it. You took responsibility without minimizing." "Yes, just like that." Harry, who had been listening from 3 feet away, said, "Where did you learn that?" "The apology structure." She said, "Snape. He's not often wrong about important things. When he is, he uses the same structure, what it was, why it was wrong, no qualification." Ron said, "My mum apologizes like that." She said, "I know. You apologized like it. The structure you know is the one she taught you." They walked back into the castle together in the way of 3 people who had been through something and had decided, without discussing it, to be each other's people because of it. She wrote to Snape that weekend. At the bottom, in smaller writing than her usual documentation, Harry came through the door. So did Ron. I have been preparing to be capable and to be correct. I have not been preparing to need someone to come through the door. I don't know if there is a way to prepare for that. I will write more when I have worked out what it is. His reply: Good. You should have both, the capability and the people who come through the door. They are not the same thing. I have spent 20 years confusing them. You are starting from a better position than I did. Use it. You are expected to stay alive. SS. The third floor corridor. She had been reading the third floor corridor at a distance since early in term, 7 distinct magical signatures, which was more than standard protection arrangements used and more than first-year students should be encountering. She told Harry in November. He said he had been reading it since September. They compared notes. The first 2 protections were large visible deterrents. The third, Harry's reading, which she confirmed, was designed not to deter but to catch someone who had already gotten through. That's Dumbledore's, she said. How do you know? The escalation pattern. The first 2 protections stop people who want to be stopped. The third is for people who don't. Dumbledore plans for determined opposition. They spent the remaining months of first year carefully mapping what they could read without entering. Ron built the structural picture from their comparisons. Neville read the magical creature literature. Neville, in the second month of this work, said Cerberus, 3-headed. There's a species that's been used as a guardian for millennia. The signature in the first protection matches what the literature describes as Cerberus ambient magical presence. 80% confidence. She said, document the comparison. He documented it with precision that had not been available to him in September. The chess match, the logic puzzle, the mirror. She will not narrate the full sequence except to say what matters. Ron played the chess game as someone who had read the whole board for 4 minutes before making the first move, which was different from how she had ever seen him approach a game before. And he sacrificed his position to win it without the expression of someone performing sacrifice. She solved the logic puzzle in 6 minutes, took 3 more to verify, found the correct bottle, and handed Harry the vial. Forward, he said. You go forward. I go back for help. Why? Because the problem isn't the next chamber. You can manage the next chamber. The problem is Ron. And what comes after this, and for that I need to go back. He nodded. Harry, she said. Read the situation before you act. Whatever you find in there, read it first. I know you know. I'm saying it because the stakes are high enough that I want to say it explicitly. He said, you're still working out when you need things to be explicit. Yes, this is one of those times. He said, I'll read before I act. She went back through the purple flame. She went to Snape's office and knocked. He opened the door. He read her face. He stepped back. She said, the third floor corridor. I'll tell you everything in the order you need to hear it. There isn't much time. He said, then begin. The days after, Sirius arrived through the flue in McGonagall's office and was in the hospital wing 12 minutes later, carrying the specific quality of someone who has been managing their response to a situation for 3 days and is now finally in proximity to the person the situation was about. He stopped at the end of Harry's bed. Harry said, I'm fine. Sirius said, I know. Hermione told me. He sat in the chair beside the bed and said nothing for a long moment, which was Sirius's version of composing himself. Then he looked across at Hermione and said, You wrote to me before he was out of that corridor. Yes, accurate information first, before anyone else's version could reach me. That's the principle. He read her with the assessment she recognized from Harry's descriptions, complete, without performance. He said, You have his eyes. She said, I have my own eyes. A pause. He said, I mean the way you look at things. He looked at things like they owed him the truth, and he intended to collect it. She considered this. That's accurate, she said. Snape arrived on the 4th day, at 4:30 in the afternoon, when the hospital wing was at its quietest, which was precisely when she had known he would come. He stood in the doorway and read the room. She said, "The chair at the foot is available." He came in. He did not take the chair at the foot. He stood at the specific distance of someone maintaining a position that was neither comfortable nor hostile, the distance of someone who had not yet decided what the space required of him. Sirius lowered the newspaper he had been performing reading. He said, "Severus." Snape said, "Sirius." The quality of the air changed. Not tension, the static charge before weather. Two people with the full weight of a shared past standing in a room that held someone who had come from both of them, shaped by neither. Harry looked at both of them and said, "I'm glad you're both here." He said it the way he said things that mattered, not performing the gladness, simply stating it as a fact and letting it do its own work in the room. Sirius put the newspaper down. Snape looked at Harry. "Your account." From the corridor. Harry told it again, the same account he had given Hermione, with the economy of someone who had found which details carried weight and which were incidental. When he finished, Snape said, "The mirror." "What did you see?" "Myself with the stone, finding it, not using it, and that's what produced the result. Yes, I wanted to find it to stop Quirrell, not to use it." Snape said Dumbledore's protection design. Sirius said it worked, on the assumption the intended user was Harry Potter, with his specific history and his specific relationship with the stone's purpose. It would not have worked on every possible intruder. It worked on the one who showed up. "This time," Snape said. Hermione said, "The protection was designed with the expected threat in mind." The expected threat was someone who wanted the stone for its properties. The design was correct for that threat. Sirius looked at her. "You take the specific case. Generalizing from a specific case produces incorrect conclusions when the case is unusual. The specific case is the actual case." Snape said, very quietly, "She's been doing that since she was 4. Sirius looked at him. A pause that held more weight than its length suggested. The weight of everything that had accumulated between them across the years when they were not in rooms together. He said, "You always knew how to do that. You just mostly chose not to." Snape said, "That was a different period." "Yes," Sirius said. "It was." Harry read both of them with the full attention of someone who had been waiting for this exact conversation for a long time and intended to receive it carefully. Hermione read all of them and filed what she read, and chose not to document this particular reading in the notebook. Some things were not for documentation. Some things were only witness. The summer after first year, Snape alive in the aftermath, the stone destroyed, Harry found, and the school returned to something like itself. The summer was correspondence, she and Harry, letters in the precise pattern they had been building since the train. Her sentences short when certain and longer when working through things. His letters doing the things she would not understand until 4th year, but had always felt as attentiveness. 2nd year, the chamber. She does not narrate this in full, because it belongs more completely to Harry and to Ron, and to the specific quality of Ginny Weasley, who went through something that 2nd year that forged in her the very particular resilience of someone who has been a vessel for something evil and walked out the other side knowing exactly what she carried and how to carry it. What Hermione narrates from that year is peripheral. She was petrified for 2 months, which meant she missed the critical resolution of events, which she found professionally frustrating in a way she acknowledged was somewhat beside the point given the circumstances. She spent the time between petrification and unpetrification thinking, which was what she did when she did not have other options. She thought about the chamber, about Salazar Slytherin, about the specific mechanisms by which one person's prejudice gets built into institutional architecture so thoroughly that 900 years later, children are still navigating the consequences. She told Snape this in her end-of-term notes. He read the relevant section and wrote in the margin, "An accurate analysis." The implication for how we address institutional prejudice is worth developing. He had not called it interesting, which was what he said when something was good. He had called it accurate, which was what he said when something was correct. Third year, Remus Lupin as defense against the dark arts professor, which produced at Grimmauld Place the specific situation of Harry's guardian trying to act normally about the person who was most important to him after Harry, while also teaching that person's classmates and managing the thing that happened once a month and had never stopped happening. Harry came home at Christmas third year and said, "Moony is very good at teaching." Sirius, who had been waiting for this information with more evident care than he intended to show, said, "Yes, he always was. He teaches the way you do. From the inside out." Sirius looked at the ceiling. He said, "That's a good way to put it, but he's steadier when he does it." Sirius was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, he is. Is that because of the condition?" "It's because of how he responded to the condition," Sirius said. "There's a difference. The condition is what happened to him. The steadiness is what he built out of it." Harry thought about this for a long time. He said, "He should teach it longer than a year." Sirius said, "I know." He didn't say the rest, which was that the ministry's regulations regarding werewolves and teaching positions made a longer tenure essentially impossible, and that this was one of several things about the ministry's regulations that he kept a running list of. At Spinner's End, Hermione had been developing the Saturday sessions, which she ran during holidays with whoever could get to London, into something beyond their original design. Neville's reading practice was now strong enough that he found things she had not, which was exactly what she had hoped for, the capacity becoming genuinely independent of its source, which was the only kind of teaching that lasted. She told Snape this in her end-of-term notes. He read the relevant section and said, "You taught him well. I taught him what you taught me. The application was yours." "Yes," she said, "the application is mine." He filed this in the way he filed things he wanted to document properly later, by going quiet and then moving on. She had learned to read his filing habits the same way she read everything else. She did not comment on them, because some systems worked best when they were not observed too closely. She was learning which things those were. The Goblet of Fire was a contract engine. She identified this in the first hour after its installation, before most students had finished their second piece of toast. She read it not for what it presented as, a selection device, but for what it actually was, a binding mechanism that used the selection process as the activation mechanism for the binding. Submission was consent. This was not a competition with withdrawal mechanisms. It was a contract with enforcement mechanisms. She told Harry over breakfast. He listened and then said, "I'm submitting." She read him. "The contract terms will be the same whether I submit myself or someone submits me for me," he said. "Someone will enter my name regardless. That's what my name has always meant. But if I enter myself, I choose my approach to the binding. If someone enters me, I inherit their approach." She thought about this. "That's meaningful," she said. "But it doesn't change the material outcome." "No," he said. "The psychological position does change, though, and the psychological position affects performance." She filed. Sirius's principle applied technically. The approach is worth choosing even when the outcome isn't. She spent 14 hours on the full analysis. What she produced, the Goblet's contract mechanism, was ancient, pre-ministry, operating on the principle of magically witnessed consent. The binding required performance of the tournament tasks, and the consequences for refusal involved a loss of magical ability or compulsion to perform. Or both. The historical documentation was ambiguous enough that she would not pretend otherwise. She told Harry this. "Not a real choice," he said. "A constrained set of options that presents as one, which is why someone is entering your name, because the contract removes the real choice while appearing to create one." He submitted his name. The goblet produced 4 names. His was the 4th, the dragon task. She watched from the stands not as entertainment but as reading. Cedric Diggory approached the Swedish short snout with the quality of someone implementing a prepared plan. Competent. The judges scored the approach moderately. They read someone who had prepared for the situation rather than with the situation. Fleur Delacour approached the common Welsh green with the quality of someone who trusted her own capabilities. The trust was warranted, the performance strong. Her quality of approach score was higher than Cedric's because the judges read confidence in the relationship to the challenge. Victor Krum approached the Chinese fireball with a conjunctivitis curse, blinding the dragon, which was conceptually clever, but the blinded animal promptly went berserk. It swung into the nesting ground and crushed 3 of the real eggs before it could be brought under control. The judges took points for the collateral damage. Victor's score was lower than Fleur's, and his approach, bold in concept, costly in execution, was noted in the commentary as an example of solving the wrong problem. He had eliminated his own threat while creating a larger one. Harry approached the Hungarian horntail. She watched the 3 seconds before he raised his wand. He was reading the dragon, not looking at it, reading it, the full situational read she had been developing with him since 3rd year. Then he summoned his broom. She had not anticipated this. She read the logic immediately. The broom made him mobile. Mobility allowed him to read the dragon from multiple angles simultaneously. Multiple angles produced better situational awareness than a fixed position. He was not solving the problem of the dragon. He was putting himself in the position from which he could read the problem accurately before responding to it. His quality of approach score was the highest of the 4 champions. She wrote to Snape that evening, he applied the framework exactly correctly. I wanted you to know. His reply, document it. The Triwizard year ended at the graveyard. What Voldemort returned with, what the blood ritual took. She does not narrate this in full here, because Harry carried the full account himself and told it to her exactly once in the weeks that followed. And what he told her she has never repeated except in the specific clinical contexts where accurate information required it. What she does narrate, the information changed. Before the graveyard, Voldemort was a historical problem with present implications. After, a present problem requiring active response. She spent the first weeks of summer in Snape's library, reading everything available on the deflection of the killing curse, on sacrificial protection magic, on blood ritual mechanics, and the connections they produced. The blood-taking component had been not incidental, but specific. Blood of the enemy, forcibly taken. The ritual was designed to use Harry's particular blood. Specific blood created a specific connection. The connection was not unidirectional. The donor and recipient were now linked. Which meant Voldemort carried a connection to Harry, and Harry had carried a connection to Voldemort since the night the curse rebounded. 2 connections in opposite directions. She wrote to Harry, "What I'm worried about is the body. The blood component of the ritual created an ongoing connection between you and Voldemort that I don't have precise language for yet. I know it exists. I don't know what it does over time. Write back about the blood, what it felt like, as precisely as you can." He wrote back. She read his description. She read it again. She began building the framework. Umbridge arrived in September of the following year, and the Ministry arrived with her. She read Umbridge in the first lesson, a bureaucratic intelligence organized around the preservation of the institutional structures that granted her power. Intelligent within her own system, useless the moment the system's interests and hers diverged. Because she had no other frame of reference. She was not here to teach. She was here to ensure that whatever they learned about defense did not exceed what the Ministry currently found convenient. Hermione told Harry this after the lesson. He said, "So, we teach ourselves." The room of requirement opened itself to them in October, which Harry found by the same method he found everything. Reading the quality of a corridor, the specific way certain doors were not quite what walls were. They began small. 2 meetings a week, a sign-up parchment that Hermione had written a very specific jinx into, a curriculum she designed and Harry delivered. The distinction mattered, and they had never discussed it, which was how they handled most things they fully agreed on. What she designed, a progression from spell mechanics to situational reading, layered so the mechanics served the reading rather than the other way around. What Harry taught, the inside experience of performing magic correctly, the quality of certainty that came from calibrated instinct rather than executed theory. The two approaches together produced something neither of them could have produced alone. Luna Lovegood attended from the third session and contributed the perspective of someone who approaches problems from angles that no one else has considered, which was occasionally obstructive and occasionally the most useful thing in the room. She had the unusual property of being entirely unconcerned with whether her contributions were received well, which meant that what she said was always what she actually thought, which meant that her assessments, when they were relevant, were always accurate. Hermione documented this and told Harry. He said, "I know. I've been watching her. For how long?" "Since the train, second year." Hermione filed. Harry builds long reading baselines without mentioning it. Neville's development in the DA sessions was, by the 5th week, the most significant data point Hermione had. Not because he had more talent than the others, he did not, by straightforward measurement, but because his confidence had been the gap all along, and the sessions were closing it. He performed in the DA with the focused attention of someone who had been reading situations for 4 years and was now able to trust what his readings told him, which meant that when he cast a spell it had the quality of something intended rather than something attempted. The difference was visible. McGonagall noticed it across subjects and mentioned it at the end of term, which Hermione noted but did not share with Neville because she thought he needed to notice it himself first. Ginny Weasley, who had been attending since the second meeting, and who read situations with the efficiency of someone who had learned the skill young and kept it sharp, was the one who named them. "Dumbledore's Army," she said, at the end of a session in early November, when someone asked what they should call themselves. "Because that's what the Ministry's afraid of, isn't it? Not us. Him. We just happen to be training ourselves to be worth his time." The name was adopted unanimously. Ginny had, over 4 years, become the most efficient social reader in their group, which was a significant thing to say. Because Ron had native social intelligence, and Harry had the anticipatory reading, and Hermione had everything she had been built with. What Ginny had was the specific reading of power, who had it, how it moved, where it was being used badly. She had learned it the way second-youngest children learn it in large households, by being the person who always had to navigate around someone else's established territory, and she had refined it significantly in her second year when she had encountered the specific power of a 40-year-old magical impression pretending to be a diary and had survived it. She did not speak often in the DA sessions. When she did, it was the accurate thing. The Department of Mysteries. Harry had the vision. Sirius was in danger, or appeared to be. The distinction, which she tried to raise, did not penetrate in time. She does not assign blame for this. She understands what it is to receive information that sounds like someone you love in pain and find that every rational framework momentarily fails. What she narrates instead, what she understood afterward. Sirius Black, who in this world was an active order member known to the Ministry and free to operate openly, had been brought to the Department of Mysteries because Voldemort had specifically arranged the vision, knowing that Harry would receive it and knowing what Harry would do with it. Sirius had come because Harry was there. And the Department of Mysteries, with its veiled archway and the sound that it made, and the way it seemed to pull at anyone with enough magic and enough grief, was the end of Sirius Black. Not as a fugitive, not as an escaped prisoner, as a man who had been free for 14 years and used his freedom to raise the godson who now watched him fall through the veil. This was the specific cruelty of it, that Voldemort had understood, with the precision of someone who had been studying his opponents for years, that the cleanest way to hurt Harry was not through Harry himself, but through the person Harry most trusted. Remus was the one who told her, when she arrived at the Ministry. He came around a corner in the Department of Mysteries corridor, and she read his face before he said anything. She had been reading Remus Lupin for 4 years, through Harry's descriptions, through the months when he taught at Hogwarts, through the times he had sat in the kitchen at Grimmauld Place and been steadily and quietly present, and she could read what his face held now, which was the look of someone in the first hour of a grief they have not yet finished receiving. She said, "Where is he?" Remus said, "He's gone." She read this. She said, "Where is Harry?" with Dumbledore. She found a wall and put her back against it, and read the situation with the full attention she gave to all significant situations, because that was what she had, instead of crying in that particular moment. And because the reading was also a form of being with what was true, rather than being outside it. She thought, Sirius is in Harry's decision-making. He is in the way Harry reads a situation before acting. He is in how Harry names the honest thing when the easier thing is available. He is not gone from that. She filed this to tell Harry later, when later was the right time. She wrote to Snape that night, "I am here. Sirius is not. Harry is." She stopped and did not write the next word because the next word was not ready. She sent the letter with just those 3 lines. His reply arrived in 1 sentence, "I know. Stay with him." She did. And she kept staying. The months after were correspondence, 1-sentence letters when that was all Harry had, letters that did not demand response. She had learned this from Snape's 1-sentence reply the night of the Department of Mysteries, which had been the most useful thing she received that night. She transmitted the method to Harry because it was what he needed, and because some debts are not counted but paid. The Horcrux research took 2 years. She had estimated 2 years in the summer after the Department of Mysteries, based on the volume of source material, the number of languages involved, the depth of the magical theory underlying the fragmentation mechanism, and her own processing rate. The estimation was accurate. This was not a source of pleasure exactly. The satisfaction of having calibrated correctly, in the context of a project whose subject was this dark, was a specific, strange thing that she filed and did not examine closely. What the 2 years produced, the mechanism of Horcrux creation, was deliberate soul fragmentation through the act of murder. The fragment anchored in an object or, in one known case, a living creature. The anchored fragment sustained the creator's existence independent of their physical body. The vulnerability, the fragment was not immortal, only anchored. An anchor could be removed. The removal destroyed the protection. The specific vulnerability, anchored soul fragments, retained a connection, oriented, not bidirectional, pointing from the fragment toward the source. The orientation could be read. She told Snape about this in the autumn of that year in a letter that described what she was reading without naming what it was. His reply, "What you're describing is soul geometry, a branch of magical theory addressing the structure of the soul at a level below standard magical analysis. It predates most formal disciplines. The fact that you can read it without training indicates native capacity at a level I should have anticipated. I am retrospectively revising my assessment. This also means your theoretical framework is more reliable than your own confidence estimate, because your native capacity provides a direct reading of what the model predicts. Tell Potter," she told Harry. He said, "You can find them. I can identify where to look. When I'm close enough, I can read the orientation and follow it to the fragment. And destroying the fragment requires something capable of permanently damaging a soul-level structure. Basilisk venom. Fiendfire, the killing curse applied directly to the anchoring object. He was quiet. "There's a fragment in me," he said. "Yes, you've known since. Since first year." "Yes, and you're telling me now. Because now is when the information becomes necessary. Before now, knowing would have changed your relationship to the situation without changing what needed to be done. Now it changes what needs to be done. He received this with the stillness of someone who had been prepared well enough to hold large things. He said, "What does it mean for me to be carrying it? It means Voldemort cannot die while you carry the fragment. It anchors him the same way the others do. For him to die, the fragment in you has to be addressed first. Can it be addressed without 'yes'?" she said, before he finished. "I have been working on that specific question since I understood what the fragment was. I have a theoretical framework for separation that does not require the host's death. It is the most complex theoretical work I have done. I believe it is correct. I have a high confidence level based on the theoretical consistency of the framework and 3 external checks I've been able to apply. I won't tell you it's certain when it isn't." "What's the confidence level?" "High. Higher than I initially calculated, because the soul geometry native capacity gives me a direct read of what the model predicts rather than an indirect application of it. Then that's what we work with." She looked at him. "You're not going to weigh the alternative?" "I've thought about it," he said. "The alternative, not removing the fragment, means Voldemort doesn't die and the war continues. Whatever risk exists in the separation is less than that. The calculation isn't difficult." She said Sirius would have said the same thing. Harry was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "He would have." The night the Battle of Hogwarts began, she read the castle the way she had read it for 7 years. Its corridors, its magical density, the specific ways its old protections interacted with the new violence being done to it. She had been reading the fragment's architectural space continuously for 3 weeks. Not full attention, background awareness. The same peripheral reading she applied to any significant variable in an ongoing situation. It was tiring. Her letters to Harry in those 3 weeks had been shorter than usual, and he had read the shortness correctly and not commented on it, which was one of the things about him that mattered. She positioned herself in the Great Hall when the battle proper began, where the ambient, magical density was highest. She could guide the separation from here. She had been over the mechanics so many times they were structural, she would read the fragment's architectural space directly, real time, adjusting as the physical reality of the work differed from the theoretical model, because reality always differed somewhat from the model, and the difference was where the real work happened. When the final external fragment, Nagini, was destroyed, she felt the structure change. The settling was exactly what she had described to Harry that it would be. She was already standing when he came through the hall's doors. He came directly to her position, which meant he had read where she would be before he arrived. He said, "I felt it. Yes, 15 minutes, perhaps 20, before the structure begins to destabilize again. Sit down." He sat. She sat across from him. "I'm going to read the fragment's architectural space," she said. "Tell me what you feel as you feel it." "All right." She began. The reading was the deepest she had done, deeper than any prior work, which meant she was operating without a reliable baseline, which was the kind of work she had been learning to do since Neville asked the question in 2nd year that took the framework apart. No baseline. What is there? Read what is there. What was there? Harry's soul structure, which was the most familiar thing she had read over 7 years of reading him across every available medium. She knew it the way she knew her own handwriting, the pattern of it, the way it was organized, the relationship between its components. And in the structure, separate in the way that foreign matter and tissue is separate from the tissue, the fragment. Old, decades older than Harry. It had the quality of something that had been in a place long enough to adapt to it without belonging. She read the fragment's architectural space. She read where the separation had to happen. She began. Halfway through, Harry said quietly, "Something is happening. Tell me." Like a pressure. Not pain. Like something held and then being released. That's the fragment releasing its anchor points. "Stay still." He stayed still. She read. She adjusted. She read. The fragment separated. Not violently. Cleanly. in the specific way of things that have been held in place and are now permitted to move in the direction they were already oriented. And then it dispersed, which was not what her model had predicted, but which, in the moment of reading the dispersal, she understood. A fragment separated from its source and this way had no anchor to return to. It dissolved back into the ambient magical substrate, not destroyed but unmade. Returned, she stopped reading. She looked at Harry. He said, "Is it done?" She read him, the full read, the 7-year accumulated framework. "Yes," he exhaled. "How do you feel?" she said. He read himself, the internal reading practice they had been developing together for years. Like something I didn't know was weight is gone. You couldn't feel it while it was there. No, only now that it isn't. He looked at her. "Hermione, yes, the reading you just did. I could feel you doing it. There was a quality to it that I don't have the word for." She said, "What did it feel like?" He said, "Like being seen very accurately." "Yes," she said, "that's what it is. You've been doing that for 7 years. Reading you. Yes, does it cost you anything? Reading people." She considered this honestly. Reading structures costs very little. Reading people costs something. Reading that cost more than usual. Because it was the most complex reading. Because it was the most important. I cared about the outcome in a way that makes the reading more costly. He read her. He said, "Rest. After. After what? After what you still need to do." "I don't need to do anything," she said. "The fragment is gone. The rest of the work is yours. It always was. Go," he stood. She read him standing. And what she read was the structure she had been reading since first year, the same architecture, cleared now, finally only itself. She said, "The reading says what I thought it would say. Which is, that you've been built for this. Not by prophecy, by 7 years of work. The two are not the same thing." He said, "I know." He went. She sat. She waited. She read. Ron found her an hour after. He sat beside her on the floor without speaking. After 4 minutes he said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I'm very tired and I need food." He produced something from his pocket. He always had something from his pocket. This had been true since the second day on the Hogwarts Express and had not changed. She ate. He said, "Did it work?" "Yes," he said. "I've been watching you do things I don't understand for 7 years. I know. I mean, that you've always trusted me to be useful even when I couldn't understand what you were doing. I want you to know I've noticed." She read him. "You are useful," she said, "and the trusting part, that's because you're trustworthy. The two things are related but distinct. When did you work that out?" "3rd year. I documented it." He said, "Of course you did." She almost smiled. He saw it. He didn't comment on it. That, she thought, was exactly why. Neville found her at 7 in the morning. He came directly to her position, which meant he had read the space before arriving, which was the culmination of 7 years of watching her do it and building the practice into himself. He said, "Snape. He's alive. He's at St. Mungo's. Pomfrey got to him in time." She was quiet. She said, "How certain are you?" McGonagall confirmed it. She said, "Thank you." He sat down on the other side of her and did not say anything else. She sat between Ron and Neville and read the hall, and read the certainty of Snape's continued existence in the world, which she had not been certain of when the night began. And what that produced in her she did not attempt to document, because some things were not for documentation. Some things were only the thing itself. Harry found her at 8. He sat across from her. She read him. He had slept for perhaps an hour. The specific quality of someone who had done an enormous thing and then immediately been needed to do a number of adjacent administrative things, and was now, finally, here, she said, "You planned for Snape's safety. Since February. I knew what Voldemort was going to do with him. I couldn't tell you. I needed you reading the structure without the emotional interference of knowing Snape was in specific danger. She read this. The analysis is correct, she said. But? No but. I would have made the same call. A pause. Sirius would have made it the same way. Harry was very still. He would have, he said. Exactly the same way. She said, he's still here, in how you make decisions. He's still here. He looked at the far wall of the great hall. He said, yeah. And then, very quietly, yeah. She wrote to Snape from the waiting room of St. Mungo's where they would not let her in for another 3 hours. She wrote, "You're alive. I'm told you know this, but I need to write it. 7 years. You taught me to read everything, and the first thing I read clearly this morning was that you were still alive, and it was the most important reading of the day. The fragment is gone. The mechanism worked exactly as I said it would, with real-time adjustments made possible by the native capacity you identified in the autumn. What I'm trying to say, thank you for identifying it. Thank you for every correction that was accurate, and every concession that came without conceding. Thank you for teaching me to read things as they are rather than as I want them to be. I have more to say. I'll say it at 11. H.G. They let her in at 11. He was awake, the specific quality of someone who has come back from the edge of one state without fully arriving at the other. His eyes were open, and they were reading the room with the complete assessment that was the defining quality of how he engaged with any space he was in. He saw her. She sat in the chair beside the bed. I wrote to you, she said. I received it. He read her. She read him reading her. He said, the mechanism working is what I expected. The real-time adjustment capacity is what I hoped for. You were optimistic. I was accurate. The distinction matters. Yes, she said. The distinction matters. She said, I've been reading you for 9 years. What I read has not changed in its essential quality since the second year of my life, when I understood what the reading was showing me. I kept waiting for it to change, because I wasn't certain whether permanence in a reading was reliable or whether it indicated a gap in my capacity. What conclusion did you reach? That the permanence is reliable. That what I read in you is not a gap. It's accurate data about something that doesn't change. He said, what doesn't change? She said, what you are. What you've been building since before I arrived. What you gave me when you let me in. He was quiet. She said, the method built what I am. That's not a small thing. He said, very quietly, you were already remarkable. You taught me what to do with remarkable. You taught yourself. With the method I gave you. Yes, she said. The application was mine. He read her. The full assessment, unhurried, he said what you did last night. The reading, the work, it was exactly what it should have been. She received this. She understood that this was the fullest expression of what he could give her, and that it was more than sufficient. She said, I learned from the best available source. He said, yes, you did. She went to the door. He said, Hermione. She turned. He said, you are expected to continue. She read this. She understood what it was. She said, yes, I will. Coda, what comes next? Harry was in the corridor. He fell into step beside her the way he had been falling into step beside her since the Hogwarts Express, without discussion, without arrangement, because the arrangement had never been necessary. Ginny was there too, leaning against the wall with the expression she wore when she had been holding a complicated feeling for a long time and was considering what to do with it. She looked at Harry and something passed between them that was not words. The specific exchange of two people who have read each other long enough that words are often redundant. And then she looked at Hermione and said, he's going to be all right? He's going to be all right, Hermione said. Ginny exhaled. She said, good. She said it in the specific way she said things that cost her something, where the word was small and what it carried was not. Ron was at the end of the corridor with Neville and Luna Lovegood, who had arrived at some point in the early morning and was now explaining something to Neville with the specific serenity of someone for whom the end of a war was simply the beginning of a different and equally interesting set of phenomena. Neville was listening with the full attention he had learned to bring to things, which was the version of himself that had been there all along and had simply needed the right conditions to become visible. He had fought in the final battle with the qualities she had been watching develop since first year. Not recklessness, not bravado, but the specific confidence of someone who trusts what their readings tell them and acts accordingly. Luna, not looking up from whatever she was explaining, said, "Hermione, yes? You feel different. The whole castle feels different." She said it with the straightforward certainty she brought to most observations, the certainty of someone who was not performing accuracy because performing had never occurred to her as an option. "Yes," Hermione said. "It is different. Good different," Luna said. "Good different," Hermione agreed. Harry watched them. He said, "We built something. Yes, all of us. Yes," he looked at her. "What comes next?" She considered this honestly, the way she considered everything, not for the comfortable answer but for the accurate one. She said, "We find out. That's what comes next." He nodded. He said, "Together." "Together," she said. She opened the notebook she carried everywhere and wrote at the top of a new page, "What is true today, the fragment is gone. Voldemort is dead. Snape is alive. Sirius is not, but he is present. In how Harry makes decisions, in the shape of the person Harry has become." Harry reads the situation before he acts. Ron has something in his pocket. Neville reads rooms. Ginny names things accurately. Luna is not wrong about as many things as people think. I can read soul structures directly. None of us knew, at 11 years old, what we were building. We built it anyway. The building is sound. She read the list. She added one line, "What comes next is built on this." That is sufficient. She closed the notebook. She went to find the others. The corridor extended behind them, long and stone, carrying everything a place holds when it has been used for its extreme purpose and come through it, which is different from a place that was spared. The stones held everything. She read them as she walked. She read them, and they told her, "Continue." Still continuing. Always that. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.